Okay, so this will be a brief video explaining and reflecting on the idea-expression dichotomy. So the idea-expression dichotomy is, in effect, a exception or limitation on the scope of copyright protection. Generally, the scope of copyright protection is very broad. As you know, copyright protects any original work of authorship or any original element of a work of authorship fixed in a tangible medium. That includes just about everything, right? I mean, almost anything can satisfy those really minimal criteria because just about everything is not merely copied from somewhere else. And fixation is almost inevitable with the way we create works of authorship in the modern era. So the idea-expression dichotomy essentially says that while copyright presumptively applies to all expressions, it doesn't necessarily apply to all elements or all aspects of every expression. Copyright protects the concrete expressions themselves, but doesn't necessarily protect the abstract ideas or even some of the more concrete ideas that are actually contained in or realized by those concrete expressions. In other words, copyright is really intended to protect the particular things that people express, not the kind of general genre in which they're engaging in that expression. And you can kind of think of it as like a continuum, right? On one end, you've got concrete expressions. On the other end, you've got abstract ideas. And there's an awful lot of gray area in the middle. We know what the outcome is on both ends. Copyright protects concrete expressions and doesn't protect abstract ideas. But as ideas become more concrete, eventually they become protectable. And as expressions are abstracted, eventually they become unprotectable. And this kind of theoretical framework becomes even more complicated when we try to apply it in practice. So there's three different cases providing examples of how courts have thought about this problem. Two of them historical and one of them more contemporary. And hopefully they will help illuminate how it is that courts have reflected on the nature of this problem. So in the Copyright Act, it kind of lays out this general principle, right? Copyright protects original works of authorship, but doesn't protect ideas. What does that mean in practice? Well, one nice illustration of this question is Paris v. Hexamer, a 19th century case, really old case, but nonetheless one that is quite helpful in understanding this problem. So what happened? In the 19th century, fire insurance maps were really important kind of social economic technology. Essentially what they were was maps that were designed to help insurers determine the risk of fire destroying particular buildings. And they were coded in ways that insurers could look at the maps and calculate how risky writing an insurance policy on a particular building would be. So Paris had created fire insurance maps for one city, I believe it was New York City. And Hexamer was actually somebody who had worked for him. So Paris created these fire insurance maps and used a particular color coding key to convey information about the relative degree of risk presented to different kinds of buildings. So different colors and different other graphical forms of representation corresponded to the relevant risk level of the building in question. And Hexamer decided to make similar maps for other cities and essentially borrowed the schema that Paris used. In other words, Hexamer in his maps used the same key to identify the risk factors that Paris had used. And this was done, of course, in order to make the maps more useful, right? I mean, you want to have a consistent set of symbols across maps. It makes them easier to read. It makes them interchangeable with each other. But Paris's heirs, Paris kind of in the interim passed away, Paris's heirs brought a copyright infringement action against Hexamer, alleging that Hexamer had improperly appropriated this scheme of creating fire insurance maps and designating the relevant risk using these various features. And ultimately, the Supreme Court found that there was no infringement because the scheme itself was not copyrightable. It was merely an idea that conveyed information and not a particular expression of an idea. In other words, the schema was too abstract to be protectable, or another way we might think about it is kind of the scheme was functional as well. And so there's a certain amount of crossover between the idea of the idea-expression dichotomy and the concept of copyright functionality. In other words, on one level, we could say that the legend or key to the maps was an idea that was too abstract. It was insufficiently concrete to be protectable. Copyright could protect the maps themselves. It couldn't protect the way that the information was communicated by the maps, right? Or you could think of it as a functionality question. And functionality, of course, is also not the subject matter of copyright. Copyright, in that sense, could protect the map itself, but couldn't protect the function of the maps or how the maps went about achieving that functionality. Two different ways of thinking about the same problem. Okay, very shortly afterward, the Supreme Court decided Baker v. Sultan, which in many respects was very similar. So what happened there? Well, Selden created or rather published a book describing, a very short book, in fact, describing a method of accounting. Essentially, it was a version of double entry accounting that was improved in certain ways. And Selden thought that this was going to be really successful and popular. It turned out that it wasn't. And he didn't sell very many copies of it despite his best efforts, and it really didn't go anywhere. Similarly, Selden died and his heirs inherited the interest in his books. Subsequently, Baker published his own books describing a very similar method of accounting, but describing it more effectively and more usefully, apparently, because Baker's books sold really well. So Baker was selling a ton of books that were describing this method of accounting. Selden's heirs weren't selling anything, and so in a fit of pique, they filed an infringement action against Baker, alleging that Baker had improperly appropriated Selden's method book and the forms associated with Selden's method of accounting. Well, the Supreme Court looked at the problem and said, as a first matter, as an initial matter, there couldn't be an infringement action when it came to the text of the actual book itself, because Baker didn't copy the text of Selden's book. Baker wrote his own book. He just copied Selden's ideas, or arguably copied Selden's ideas, by describing a very similar, if not basically identical, method of accounting. But the court said copying the method of accounting can't be infringing. That's just a different way of describing the same thing. Selden doesn't own a copyright in the method of accounting. He owns a copyright in the particular way that he described the method of accounting, and Baker didn't copy that, so that can't be copyright infringing. The secondary claim that Selden made was that Baker was infringing the copyright in the blank forms that he included in the book, and the argument there was that Baker didn't just create his own version of the blank forms, he basically was providing his readers with essentially exactly the same forms that Selden had provided. And the Supreme Court looked to the forms and said, well, those aren't really protectable either. The blank forms are just a way of realizing this method of accounting, they too are more like ideas than they are like expressions. They're sort of a framework for engaging in this method of accounting. But again, we might see them as also being functional in a sense, right? You needed to use these particular forms in order to realize the method of accounting. If the forms are necessary to realizing the method, then they are not the proper subject matter of copyright protection either. Okay, so fast forward to many years later, and we have a very different, more kind of artistic sort of claim. So what happens? Satava is a glass artist who makes a name for himself by creating what amount to glass paperweights that depict jellyfish. And jellyfish, of course, are well suited to being depicted in glass because they have a kind of transparency and a quality that is glass-like in a sense. And so Satava develops a method of constructing glass jellyfish sculptures and encasing them in clear glass in a way that is attractive, durable, and appealing to consumers. And he sells a lot of them. He's very successful selling these glass jellyfish. Lowry is also a glass artist, sees Satava's success and thinks to himself, hey, I want to get on this racket, right? I want to sell me some glass jellyfish as well. He starts producing his own glass jellyfish, and Satava is not too happy, right? First off, Lowry is now competing with him and horning in on his market. Moreover, some people are seeing the Lowry jellyfish and thinking they're the Satava jellyfish. There's some confusion between the two, and Satava doesn't like it, right? He wants to have a monopoly on creating glass jellyfish. He brings an infringement action against Lowry, and really interesting outcome, right? The court says, look, you can own a copyright in the particular way that you expressed a glass jellyfish. So we can see a Satava glass jellyfish on the left. The Supreme Court said, or the Ninth Circuit says, look, you can own a copyright in that particular expression of a glass jellyfish, but you can't own a copyright in the idea of a jellyfish sculpture in glass. And the problem is Lowry didn't copy your jellyfish, right? Lowry copied the idea of creating a glass jellyfish, because after all, if you compare the Satava and the Lowry jellyfish, they're both glass jellyfish. They're both similar, but they're not the same. And the court says, look, you know, if there, to the extent there are protectable elements in the Satava jellyfish, the protectable elements are the particular concrete visual expressions that are included in the Satava glass jellyfish, not the abstract idea of a glass jellyfish writ large. Therefore, Lowry's jellyfish can't be infringing, even though Satava owns a copyright in his particular glass jellyfish, because the Lowry glass jellyfish just isn't similar enough to be infringing.